The day I stopped waiting for the prince to choose me was the day he finally realized he had already lost me. For years, everyone in Eldoria believed Noah Bennett would always be there. The Omega who stood quietly beside Prince Alexander Caldwell had become a familiar presence throughout the royal palace. Servants saw him walking through the halls with a gentle smile. Advisors saw him patiently supporting the future ruler. The royal family saw him as someone who brought warmth to a life filled with responsibility. But Alexander saw something different. He saw someone who would never leave. Prince Alexander Caldwell had spent his entire life preparing to become king. Every decision, every conversation, and every moment of his day was shaped by duty. He carried the expectations of an entire kingdom on his shoulders, and he believed that love was the one thing in his life that would never demand his attention. Noah was always there. At breakfast, Noah remembered the small details Alexander forgot. During long meetings, Noah waited patiently until Alexander was free. On difficult days, Noah was the person who reminded him that he was more than a royal title. But because Noah never complained, Alexander slowly stopped noticing how much effort it took for him to stay. The prince never intended to hurt him. That was what made the distance between them even more painful. Alexander did not reject Noah with cruel words. He simply became too comfortable with the idea that Noah would always remain. The palace celebrated Alexander's strength, his intelligence, and his ability to lead. Yet nobody noticed the quiet moments when Noah sat alone, wondering when he had become someone who was only appreciated when he was needed. One evening, Noah waited in the royal garden with a simple hope. He wanted one conversation, one moment where Alexander would look at him and truly see him. The garden was filled with soft lights. The evening air was calm, and everything felt like it should have been a peaceful memory. When Alexander finally arrived, his mind was still focused on royal matters. He apologized for being late, but he immediately began discussing another responsibility. Waiting for him the next morning, Noah listened quietly. He had heard similar words many times before. There was always another meeting, another obligation, another reason why their time could wait. That night, Noah realized something he had been afraid to admit. He was not leaving because he stopped loving Alexander. He was leaving because he had spent too long loving someone who believed he would never walk away. The next morning, the palace continued as usual. Guards stood at their posts. Servants prepared breakfast. The kingdom moved forward. But somewhere inside the quiet halls, a decision had already been made. Noah Bennett began preparing for a life beyond the palace walls. He folded his belongings carefully. He looked around the room that had once felt like home. There were memories everywhere, but memories are not enough to make someone feel chosen. And for the first time, Noah allowed himself to imagine a future where he was not waiting for someone else to realize his worth. Meanwhile, Prince Alexander Caldwell continued his day, believing everything was still the same. He believed Noah would be there when he returned. He believed some things never changed. He did not know that the person he assumed would stay forever was already learning how to leave. The Palace of Eldoria had always been a place where every sound carried meaning. The footsteps of royal guards represented protection. The ringing of bells represented tradition. The voices of advisors represented duty. But nobody noticed the quiet sound that had slowly disappeared from Prince Alexander Caldwell's life. Noah Bennett's voice. In the weeks before Noah left, the signs had been there. They were not dramatic moments that would make people stop and stare. They were small moments that were easy to ignore, and that was exactly why they hurt the most. Noah used to wait outside Alexander's study every evening, hoping for a few minutes together after another long day of royal responsibilities. At first, Alexander always promised he would finish quickly. Then one meeting became two. One task became another. And eventually, Noah stopped asking. He learned that disappointment was easier to carry when he expected nothing. Prince Alexander believed he was doing what was necessary. As the future king of Eldoria, he had been raised to place the kingdom before himself. He believed sacrifice was part of leadership. He believed Noah understood. After all, Noah had always been patient. Noah had always smiled. Noah had always stayed. That was the mistake Alexander never realized he was making. He confused patience with endless waiting. He confused love with certainty. He believed that because Noah loved him, Noah would never choose to leave. Around the palace, people admired their connection. They saw Noah as the perfect companion for the prince. They noticed how Noah softened Alexander's serious nature and brought peace into his demanding world. But admiration from others could not replace the attention Noah needed from Alexander himself. One afternoon, Noah prepared a quiet dinner in the private dining room. It was nothing extravagant. He did not want a royal event. He only wanted a simple evening where they could talk like two people instead of a prince and an omega surrounded by expectations. The candles were lit. The table was prepared. The evening passed slowly, but Alexander never arrived. When he finally entered hours later, he apologized immediately. He explained that the royal council needed his attention and that he had lost track of time. Noah listened with a gentle expression. "I understand," Noah said, and those 3 words carried more sadness than anger ever could, because Alexander heard forgiveness. He did not hear exhaustion. He did not hear the quiet pain behind them. Later that night, Noah stood alone by the palace window, looking at the lights of Eldoria below. He remembered the first time Alexander smiled at him without the weight of the crown on his shoulders. He remembered the moments when they were simply two people who enjoyed being together. Those memories were precious, but they were also becoming reminders of what had changed. Noah did not want a perfect prince. He did not need grand promises or a life surrounded by luxury. He only wanted to feel chosen. The next morning, Alexander left for another royal meeting, completely unaware that Noah had already made his decision. For the first time, Noah did not wait by the door. He did not prepare a message asking Alexander to understand. He simply continued packing the final pieces of his life. The palace remained full of people, but Noah felt invisible inside it. And somewhere deep inside, he accepted the truth he had avoided for too long. Love was not measured by how long someone could wait. Love was measured by whether someone noticed you were waiting at all. The final night Noah Bennett spent inside Eldoria Palace was quieter than he expected. There was no dramatic goodbye, no angry words, no attempt to make Prince Alexander Caldwell feel guilty. Just a quiet room, a small collection of memories, and a decision that had taken months to make. Noah moved slowly through the chamber he had once believed would become his forever home. Every corner carried a reminder of the life he had built beside Alexander. The books they discussed during peaceful evenings, the small decorations he had chosen to make the room feel less like a royal residence and more like a place where two people belonged. The memories were beautiful, and that was what made leaving so difficult. Noah did not stop loving Alexander. That was the truth he had accepted before making his choice. He was not leaving because his feelings disappeared. He was leaving because he had finally understood that love could not survive when only one person continued reaching forward. For years, Noah had believed that if he waited a little longer, Alexander would notice. If he gave more understanding, Alexander would finally see how much he cared. If he stayed patient, the prince would eventually choose him the way Noah had always chosen Alexander. But waiting had slowly changed from an act of love into a quiet way of losing himself. Before leaving, Noah placed a simple letter on the desk. He did not write accusations. He did not list every forgotten promise or every lonely evening. He only wrote the truth. He thanked Alexander for the moments that had been real. He thanked him for the kindness he had shown in the beginning. And he explained that he needed to find a place where he was valued, without having to ask for it. When the first light of morning entered the palace windows, Noah walked through the halls one last time. Servants greeted him warmly, unaware that this was goodbye. The palace had been his world for years, but now it felt like a place where he had been waiting for someone who was never truly looking back. Outside the gates of Eldoria, Noah took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about Alexander's schedule, Alexander's duties, or Alexander's expectations. He was thinking about himself. The journey ahead was uncertain, but it belonged to him. Meanwhile, Prince Alexander continued his morning exactly as he always had. He attended meetings. He reviewed reports. He listened to discussions about the future of the kingdom. Everything appeared normal. That was what made the moment even more painful later. Alexander returned to his private chambers, expecting to see Noah's familiar presence. He expected the usual greeting. He expected the quiet comfort that had become part of his daily life. Instead, he found silence. The room was neat, but something important was missing. The small signs of Noah's presence were gone. The warmth that had filled the space had disappeared. Alexander stood there for several moments, confused by a feeling he could not immediately explain. He had spent so long believing Noah would always be there that he never considered what life would feel like without him. And for the first time, the prince who had always been surrounded by people felt completely alone. The reality he never prepared for had finally arrived. Noah Bennett was no longer waiting. The first morning without Noah Bennett felt ordinary to everyone except Prince Alexander Caldwell. The palace continued moving as it always had. The guards changed shifts. The servants prepared breakfast. The royal council gathered for another day of discussions. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside Alexander's private chambers, everything felt different. He stood in the quiet room, looking at the spaces where Noah's presence had once filled every corner. The chair near the window where Noah used to read. The table where they shared conversations after long days. The small details Alexander had never thought about because he assumed they would always remain. For the first time, the prince understood the meaning of absence. It was not just someone being gone. It was the sudden realization that the things you considered permanent were never guaranteed. At first, Alexander tried to convince himself that Noah simply needed time. He believed this was a temporary moment of emotion and that eventually Noah would return. After all, Noah had always been patient. Noah had always understood. But as the days passed, Alexander began noticing the truth he had ignored for so long. Noah had not been patient because leaving was impossible. Noah had been patient because he loved him, and love had finally reached its limit. The prince continued his responsibilities, but his focus was no longer the same. During meetings, he found himself remembering small moments he once overlooked. Noah waiting quietly outside the study. Noah leaving a warm drink beside his papers during late nights. Noah asking simple questions about his day when everyone else only cared about the future king. Alexander had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Status, influence, approval. Noah was different. Noah had wanted the person behind the crown. That realization was harder to accept than any royal challenge. One evening, Alexander returned to the garden where Noah had once waited for him. The same flowers surrounded the path. The same evening light covered the palace walls. But the person who had made that place meaningful was gone. Alexander remembered all the times Noah had stood there, hoping for a few moments together. He remembered every time he said he was too busy. Every time he believed there would be another chance tomorrow. The painful truth was that tomorrow had always been his excuse. He had spent so much time preparing for a future that he forgot to protect the present. The royal council soon noticed the prince's change. Alexander was still responsible. He was still capable. But the confidence he once carried had become quieter. His advisors asked if something was wrong, but Alexander struggled to explain. How could he describe losing someone who was never officially taken away? How could he explain that he had not been abandoned by someone who stopped caring? He had been left by someone who cared too much for too long. Weeks passed, and the palace slowly adjusted to Noah's absence. Everyone moved forward, but Alexander remained caught between memory and regret. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived from a distant town outside Eldoria. It contained a simple message about someone who had started a new life far away from the palace. Someone who was no longer waiting for a prince to notice him. Alexander read the name carefully. Noah Bennett. And for the first time, he understood that finding Noah again would not be about bringing back the past. It would be about facing the person he had become after losing the one person who truly loved him. Finding Noah Bennett was easier than Prince Alexander Caldwell expected, but facing him again was far more difficult than any royal challenge he had ever encountered. After weeks of searching, Alexander finally arrived in a quiet town several hours away from Eldoria Palace. It was a place completely different from the world he knew. There were no grand halls, no royal guards, and no people waiting for every decision to come from a prince. There were only peaceful streets, familiar faces, and a community where everyone seemed to know each other. For the first time in his life, Alexander saw a world where people valued kindness more than status. And somewhere in that world was the person he had lost. Alexander found Noah at a small community center near the town square. Through the open windows, he saw Noah helping organize books and supplies for local families. Noah looked different, not physically but emotionally. There was a confidence in his expression that had not been there before. He laughed easily. He spoke with people naturally. He belonged there. Alexander stood quietly for a moment, realizing something that was difficult to accept. Noah had not been waiting for him to return. Noah had created a life where he was happy without him. When Noah finally noticed Alexander standing nearby, the moment felt heavier than either of them expected. Years of memories existed between them, but so did months of silence. "Prince Alexander," Noah said calmly. The formal title surprised him more than he wanted to admit. There was a time when Noah simply called him Alexander. There was a time when the distance between them did not exist. Alexander took a slow breath. "I came here because I needed to speak with you." Noah nodded, but his expression remained careful. About what? Alexander had prepared countless words during the journey. He had imagined explanations, apologies, and promises. But standing in front of Noah, he realized none of those words mattered unless they came from honesty. "About what I failed to see," Alexander said. Noah remained silent. "I thought you would always be there," Alexander continued. "I thought because you loved me, you would understand every time I chose duty first. I never considered that one day you would stop waiting." The honesty in his voice surprised Noah. This was not the confident prince who had walked through the palace halls believing everything would remain the same. This was someone finally admitting that he had made a mistake. "I did not leave because I stopped caring," Noah said quietly. "That was the hardest part. I left because I cared too much about someone who did not realize I was hurting." Alexander looked down, accepting the truth. He had spent so long believing Noah's silence meant everything was fine. He had never considered that silence could be someone's last attempt to protect their own heart. Over the next few days, Alexander stayed in the town, not as a prince demanding attention, but as someone willing to listen. He helped at the community center. He learned about Noah's new life. He saw the people who respected Noah not because of who he was connected to, but because of who he truly was. Slowly, Alexander understood the person he had almost lost. Noah was not someone who needed to be rescued. He was someone who had found himself. And for the first time, Alexander realized that winning Noah back would not mean asking him to return to the past. It would mean proving that the future could be different. The days Prince Alexander Caldwell spent away from Eldoria Palace changed him in ways he never expected. He had traveled to the town believing he was searching for Noah Bennett, but he slowly realized he was also searching for the person he had been before duty became the only thing he understood. In the palace, every decision had a purpose. Every conversation had a hidden meaning. Every action was connected to the future of the kingdom. But here, in this quiet town, Alexander discovered the value of simple moments. He saw Noah smile with people who respected him for his kindness, not his connection to royalty. He saw how naturally Noah cared for others without expecting anything in return. And every day, Alexander understood more clearly what he had taken for granted. Noah had never wanted a perfect prince. He had wanted a person who would notice him. One evening, after helping at the community center, Alexander and Noah walked through the quiet streets near the town square. The sunset painted the buildings with warm golden light, creating a peaceful moment that felt impossible to imagine months earlier. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was simply two people carrying years of memories and trying to understand what came next. "Do you remember when we first met?" Alexander asked. Noah smiled slightly. "You mean when you were convinced you could handle everything alone?" Alexander looked away with a small expression of embarrassment. "I suppose I was not very good at accepting help." "No, no replied. You were not." They both smiled, but the moment soon became more serious. Alexander stopped walking and looked at Noah. I need you to know something. I spent so long thinking my biggest responsibility was protecting the kingdom. But I never realized that part of protecting my future was protecting the people who mattered to me. Noah listened carefully. Alexander, I do believe you regret what happened. The prince looked surprised. But regret is not the same as change, Noah continued. I needed you to choose me when I was standing beside you, not only after I walked away. The words were painful because they were true. Alexander had spent so much time focusing on the possibility of losing Noah that he had forgotten the loneliness Noah experienced while still being there. You are right, Alexander said quietly. I cannot ask you to forget those moments. I cannot expect everything to return to how it was. Noah looked at him, seeing the difference between the prince from before and the person standing in front of him now. Alexander was no longer trying to control the outcome. He was finally listening. Back in Eldoria, rumors spread that the prince had changed. The royal council questioned why Alexander remained away from palace duties for so long. They reminded him that a future king had obligations. But Alexander no longer saw responsibility and love as opposing choices. He understood that leadership without compassion would never create the future he wanted. When he eventually returned to the palace, he did not return as the same man who had left. He carried a new understanding with him. He began making decisions with more patience, more empathy, and more awareness of the people around him. Yet one question remained in his heart. Could Noah believe in him again? Alexander knew the answer would not come from promises. It would come from time, effort, and the choices he made every day. Because this time, he was not trying to convince Noah to stay. He was trying to become someone worth staying for. Returning to Eldoria Palace did not mean Prince Alexander Caldwell could return to the person he used to be. The moment he stepped into the grand halls, he felt the difference. The palace was familiar, but he was not. The same advisors waited with the same expectations. The same responsibilities filled his schedule. The same traditions surrounded every decision. But Alexander no longer saw the world through the eyes of someone who believed duty required him to ignore everything else. He had learned something far more important. A kingdom could be protected by rules, but it could only be truly cared for by someone who understood people. The royal council quickly noticed the change. Alexander no longer dismissed personal concerns as distractions. He listened more carefully. He asked questions before making decisions. He understood that strength was not always about carrying every burden alone. For years, he believed being a great ruler meant never showing uncertainty. Now he realized that honesty was what allowed people to trust him. Still, one thing remained unfinished. Noah Bennett. Alexander returned to the town whenever his responsibilities allowed. He did not arrive with royal announcements or expectations. He came simply as Alexander. He helped at the community center. He listened to Noah's stories. He learned about the life Noah had built without him. Each visit reminded him of the same truth. Noah was not waiting for a prince to rescue him. Noah had already created his own happiness. Alexander admired that more than he could explain. But he also understood why earning Noah's trust again would take time. One evening, Alexander and Noah sat near the small garden behind the community center. The peaceful setting felt far away from the pressures of the palace. I used to think losing you would be impossible, Alexander admitted. Noah looked at him quietly. That was the problem. Alexander nodded because he understood. I know. There was no defense in his voice. No attempt to explain away his mistakes. Only acceptance. I treated your love like something permanent, he continued. Something I never had to protect because I believed it would always be there. Noah looked down for a moment. Those words were the ones he had wanted to hear long ago, but hearing them now carried a different feeling. It was not about making the past disappear. It was about finally understanding it. I do not need you to become someone else, Noah said. I needed you to notice me when I was already beside you. Alexander felt the weight of those words, because they revealed the deepest part of his mistake. He had spent so much time preparing to become a king that he forgot how to be a partner. Over the following weeks, Alexander continued, proving his change through actions rather than promises. He remembered the small details. He made time instead of asking Noah to wait. He showed patience instead of expecting forgiveness immediately. Slowly, Noah began seeing that this was not just a temporary effort from someone afraid of being alone. This was a real transformation. But the path forward was not simple. The royal council still expected Alexander to follow the old traditions. They questioned whether personal feelings should influence the future of the crown. For the first time, Alexander had to make a choice that would define the kind of ruler he wanted to become. He could return to the old way of living, where everything was controlled by expectation, or he could choose a future built on honesty, even if it required changing the traditions that had shaped him. And this time, Alexander knew exactly what mattered most. The decision Prince Alexander Caldwell faced was not about choosing between the crown and Noah Bennett anymore. It was about understanding what kind of person he wanted to become. For years, Alexander believed that tradition was something he had to follow without question. The expectations of the royal family had shaped every part of his life. But after losing Noah, he finally understood that some traditions could protect a kingdom while others could prevent people from finding true happiness. The royal council gathered in the grand chamber of Eldoria Palace, waiting for Alexander to explain his future plans. They expected the same prince who had always followed every instruction carefully. Instead, they saw someone different, someone who had learned from his mistakes. A kingdom is not strengthened by forcing people to hide what they feel, Alexander said calmly. It becomes stronger when people are treated with honesty and respect. The council members were surprised by his confidence. Alexander was not speaking as someone trying to rebel against his responsibilities. He was speaking as someone who finally understood them. He knew leadership was not about appearing perfect. It was about making choices that reflected compassion and fairness. Later that evening, Alexander returned to the town where Noah lived. He found him near the community center, organizing books and supplies for the next day. For a moment, Alexander simply watched. He remembered the past version of Noah, the one who had stood beside him in the palace and waited for attention that never came. Now he saw someone stronger, someone who had created a meaningful life without depending on him. "You came back again," Noah said with a gentle smile. Alexander nodded. "Because I want to be here." Noah looked at him carefully. "Not because you feel guilty." Alexander took a moment before answering. "No, guilt made me search for you, but understanding is what made me stay." Those words meant more than any grand promise. Noah had heard many promises before. What mattered now was whether Alexander truly understood the difference between needing someone and valuing someone. They spent the evening talking about everything they had avoided in the past. They spoke about the loneliness Noah felt inside the palace. They spoke about the fear Alexander carried as he prepared for a future he had never questioned. For the first time, they were not trying to defend themselves. They were trying to understand each other. "I do not want to return to the way things were," Noah admitted. Alexander looked at him and nodded. "Neither do I." The answer surprised Noah. "I do not want the old version of us," Alexander continued. "That version was built on you waiting and me assuming you always would. I want something different, something where we both choose each other." Slowly, Noah began to see the change he had hoped for but never expected to witness. Alexander was no longer asking him to return because he missed the comfort Noah provided. He was asking because he finally understood Noah's value. The road ahead would still require patience. Trust could not be rebuilt in a single conversation. But for the first time, both of them believed the future did not have to repeat the past. Alexander had once thought losing Noah was impossible. Now he understood something far more important. Keeping someone's heart was never about making them stay. It was about giving them a reason to choose you every day. The journey back to Eldoria Palace felt different for both of them. Months earlier, Noah Bennett had walked away believing that leaving was the only way to protect his own heart. He had not expected Prince Alexander Caldwell to understand. He had not expected the person who once believed he would always stay to finally learn why he had to leave. But now, as they walked through the palace gardens together, there was something new between them. Not the old comfort that had allowed problems to remain hidden. Not the fragile hope that one person would eventually change. Something stronger. Something built on honesty. Alexander looked around the gardens where he and Noah had shared countless memories. The same paths remained. The same flowers bloomed. But the meaning had changed. Before, Alexander saw this place as part of his royal world. Now, he saw it as a reminder that the most valuable things in life were not created by power or tradition. They were created by the people who made those moments meaningful. I used to think I had everything under control, Alexander said quietly. Noah looked at him with a gentle expression. I know. Alexander smiled slightly. I thought being a good prince meant never needing anyone. I thought if I carried every responsibility alone, I was protecting everyone around me. He paused and looked toward the palace. But I was wrong. I was not protecting you by keeping you at a distance. I was only protecting myself from admitting how much you mattered. Noah listened carefully. These were the words he had once wished to hear. But now, he no longer needed them to prove his worth. He already knew his worth. That was the difference. I am glad you understand now, Noah said. But I also need you to understand something else. I did not leave because I wanted you to chase me. I left because I needed to remember who I was without waiting for someone else to choose me. Alexander nodded. And that is why I love you. The words were simple, but they carried a meaning they never had before. It was not a declaration from a prince claiming what belonged to him. It was a confession from a man who finally understood that love was a choice made with respect. The royal kingdom slowly accepted the changes Alexander introduced. The traditions that once controlled every personal decision began to evolve. The people of Eldoria saw a different kind of ruler growing before them. A ruler who understood that compassion was not weakness. A ruler who knew that listening was just as important as leading. And beside him stood Noah, not as someone who existed only because of his connection to the crown, but as someone respected for his own kindness and strength. Years later, many people would tell stories about Prince Alexander Caldwell and the changes he brought to Eldoria. They would remember his leadership and the way he guided the kingdom into a more understanding future. But those closest to him remembered a simpler truth. They remembered that the prince who once believed someone would never leave learned the most important lesson of all. Love was never guaranteed. It was something that had to be appreciated every day. Noah and Alexander did not return to the past. They created something new, a relationship where neither person had to beg to be seen. A bond built not on expectation, but on trust. And in the end, the greatest choice they ever made was choosing each other again, freely and completely.